again, fourth graders. This video is about how to edit and revise all of your awesome fairy tales that you've been working on writing. And I've asked for a little bit of help from Mr. Hopkins. So together we are going to take a look at one of Mr. Hopkins' fairy tale writings, and we're going to edit and revise his writing together. And we're going to take a look at the rubric that you're going to be using to edit and revise your fairy tale as well. Let's take a look at his writing together. So what I have in front of me is Mr. Hopkins' fairy tale writing. And what good writers do is the first step is to read through your writing. So, Mr. Hopkins, is that fine with you if I read through your writing? Okay, great. So this is by Mr. Hopkins, and this is called Fairy Tale. An evil witch named Betty who was looking to improve her magical powers. She was roaming the land thinking of how to take over the world when she came upon the magical castle. Once upon a time there was a boy named Bob. He was born in a magical castle in the forest of Flip-and-Flap. His younger sister, Betsy, was troublemaker, and Bob spent his days looking after her. The evil witch Betty saw Betsy playing on the swing set outside of the castle and offered her some candy. Bob was busy with his chores of polishing the suits and armor all around the castle. He was polishing and polishing when he saw his sister eat the candy from the witch and turn into a turtle. Bob put on the armor and went to face the witch. The battle was immense. Lightning flashed from the witch's broomstick and bounced off the suit of armor from the magic castle. Bob lunged at the witch but missed. Betty the witch jumped on top of him and tried to force the evil candy down his throat. It fell into his mouth. Luckily, Bob spit it out just in time. He jumped up, grabbed the witch, and threw her in the dungeon. As soon as Betty was in the dungeon, his sister turned back into a little girl, and she never made trouble again. Betty lost all of her powers, and Bob eventually became king and ruler of the land. They made Betty their maid, and she needed to polish the armor for the rest of her days. Okay, Mr. Hopkins, it's always good to start off with a compliment. So, something that I really enjoyed as I read through your fairy tale was I really liked reading about the different characters and the plot. So everything that happened to the characters was really exciting and interesting. So I think you have some really great ideas to work with. Does that sound good to you? Okay, great. I don't want this to come as a shock to you, but I see a lot of mistakes. I know. But fear not, that's why we edit and revise together. So, let's see what we can do to fix up this fairy tale. If you scroll to the bottom of your fairy tale, you're going to notice that, whoa, a rubric magically appeared for you. So here is the fairy tale narrative rubric that we're going to use to grade Mr. Hopkins' fairy tale. So here we go. If I go back up here, I see that there's a couple spelling mistakes, and I know that because I see underlined words like the and magical. And so if I look down here in the 3-point column, I notice that the first part is about grammar. So correct spelling and correct use of pronouns and verbs. So because there were a couple spelling mistakes, I'm going to go ahead and use the paint bucket. And I'm going to fill in with the blue color right here, 2 points. Next is structure and mechanics. So correct punctuation and capitalization. So if I scroll back up here, as I was reading through some of Mr. Hopkins' writing, I noticed that he had a couple sentence fragments and also a couple incorrect capitalization mistakes, especially in the names. So I'm going to come down here, and because he had some fragmented sentences and some capitalization errors, I'm going to go ahead and fill in with 2 points again. Okay, next, if we look in the 3-point column, because that's what we're trying to get to in our writing, next is characters. So there's one antagonist, one protagonist, and other characters described. If I come back up in the writing, There's some different parts of the writing that's out of order, but I do notice that there's an evil witch named Betty, and then I see that there is a protagonist named Bob, and then his sister Betsy. So I do know that they're, in general, described throughout his writing. So he did a pretty good job of describing his characters. So he gets 3 points there. Good job, Mr. Hopkins. Okay, and the next is the setting. The setting is mentioned or described throughout the narrative. Let's look for that setting. So he does talk about a magical castle at the beginning, and then he goes on to talk about the magical castle in the forest of Flippin' Flap. And then I see the castle again, but I notice it's kind of out of order, so I'm going to keep that in mind as we revise his writing here in a little bit. There's a battle. I don't see anything about the castle at the end, so maybe we could add something about the castle at the end as well. So the setting is described just one time, really. So I'm going to go ahead and fill this in with 2 points. Okay, next, in the 3-point column, the rising action. Clear and detailed events that lead up to the climax. Again, as we look through his writing, I notice that some of the events are out of order. And so all of a sudden there's the evil witch, but then she's introduced later. And it's a little confusing up here at the top. So because of that, I'm going to go ahead and give Mr. Hopkins 2 points. Short event leading up to the conflict and climax, just because they're kind of out of order and it's a little confusing. Next is the conflict, an issue that pushes the narrative events forward. Let's look where that conflict is in Mr. Hopkins' writing. It's about right here. The evil witch sees Betsy playing and offered her candy, and Bob was polishing his suits of armor around the castle. And then all of a sudden he eats his sister. His sister eats the candy from the witch, which turns her into a turtle. That's a huge conflict. And that does push the events forward all the way into the end of Mr. Hopkins' writing. So nice job with the conflict, Mr. Hopkins. I'm going to give you 3 points for that. And then next is the climax. So remember, the climax is the most important or exciting part of your writing. So let's go up here and look for the climax. So the battle was immense. Lightning flashed. Bob lunged at the witch but missed. And so they're starting to fight. And then tried to force the candy down his throat, fell into his mouth. Oh no! So that's the climax. What's gonna happen? I don't know. Luckily, Bob spit it out just in time. Whew! That was a close one. So, he did a pretty good job of leading all those events up to the climax, and that is the most important part of the story, and that, Mr. Hopkins, you did a great job on that. So the next part is the conflict resolution. That means the conflict is completely resolved between characters. That means there's no more questioning about what's going to happen to the characters because there's a resolution or an ending. So let's come up here to see if there's a resolution. As soon as Betty was in the dungeon, her sister turned back into a little girl, and she never made trouble again. Betty lost all of her powers, and Bob eventually became king and ruler of the land. They made Betty their maid, and she needed to polish the armor for the rest of her days. So this whole paragraph is the resolution or the ending. We know that there's no more trouble between the characters, and there's a little bit of karma that happens with Betty. Now she has to do all of the polishing. So he did a pretty good job with his conflict resolution as well. So I'm going to go ahead and give Mr. Hopkins 3 points for that. And then finally, the theme. The theme can be drawn from the story easily without it being stated directly. So I can understand that the theme here in Mr. Hopkins' story could be something specific, but again, some of these events are out of order, which makes it a little confusing. So I'm going to come down here, and it can be drawn from the storyline, but parts of the story conflict with the theme. So I'm going to give Mr. Hopkins 2 points for that. So this is before Mr. Hopkins edits and revises his work. So let's see what we have so far. So
2 plus 2 is 4, plus 3 is 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. So right now Mr. Hopkins has 22 out of 27 points. So let me do some quick math here.
And that is an 81%. So that's a pretty low B. I think Mr. Hopkins can do a little bit better than that. Don't you think so? All right. So let's see what we can do to edit and revise his work. Let's start with correct spelling, correct pronouns and verbs. Let's come up here. Mr. Hopkins, that's not how you spell fairy tale. Don't you see the underlining? Okay, let me help you out. All you have to do is click right here on fairy and it shows you how to spell fairy tale. And this is how you spell tail, like an animal's tail. So let's fix that. T-A-L-E. Okay, and Betty, let's go ahead and fix that too. Betty should be capitalized. That's a proper noun, Mr. Hopkins. It's a name. And then magical, it sounds like there should be a J in magical, but there's not. It's a G. So let's go ahead and fix that as well. Let's see what else is underlined. So, Mr. Hopkins, do you have any idea of how to fix some of these events that are out of order here? Let's think about it. That's an excellent idea. Once upon a time is right here, so we need to take this entire paragraph and move it. So I'm going to copy, I'm going to move this down. There we go. Now once upon a time is where it should be. So let's get rid of this. Okay, let's see if this makes sense here. An evil witch named Betty, who was looking to improve her magical powers. Oh, that's a fragment. He just cut off his idea there. Let's get rid of this period. An evil witch named Betty, who was looking to improve her magical powers. Let's get rid of she. Was roaming the land thinking of how to take over the world when she came upon the magical castle. There's a lot of spaces here, so I'm going to get rid of one of these spaces to help our format. And we need to indent our paragraphs. Come on, Mr. Hopkins, you got to use the tab to indent. Don't you remember that? The battle was immense. Lightning flashed from the witch's broomstick, but bounced off of the suit of armor from the magic castle. So again, this is a compound sentence, so I'm going to put a comma here right before the conjunction. The conjunction of but. Come on, Mr. Hopkins, get it together. But bounced off the suit of armor from the magic castle. Okay, so I remember that we want to talk about the castle towards the end of the story as well to bring up the setting one more time. So let's see what we can do in this last paragraph here. All right, let's see how we did. So we fixed our spelling mistakes and our... All right, let's go back up to make sure it is completely finished. Fairy tale. I don't know about that. That's kind of a boring title. So I'm going to get rid of some of these spaces here. Let's see what kind of title we can come up with. Do you have an idea, Mr. Hopkins? Oh, that's an excellent... Why didn't I think of that? All right, let's change it to the Flippin' Flap Candy Trap. That's a good one. All right, so then we're going to come up here and correct our title and say The Flippin' Flap Candy Trap by, oopsies, Mr. Hopkins. Ha! All right. Now, that looks like a pretty good fairy tale.
I'm going to move this back down. And so let's count up our points now. 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21, 24, 27. So, Mr. Hopkins, you now have 27 out of
27 points, and that earns you an A, which is 100%. Good job, Mr. Hopkins. Fantastic work using that rubric to edit and revise your fairy tale. All right, kiddos, now it's your turn. Open up your fairy tale and scroll down to the bottom, and there will magically be a rubric ready to go for you. So do the same thing. Go ahead and figure out how many points you deserve, edit and revise all of your work, and then hopefully you will also get 27 out of 27 points. All right, have fun.